the voice of college football. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel where we break down college football like no one else with analysis from myself and from the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry. I am taking on the coaches in all the Power 5 conferences and ranking them all the way up to number 1. We start in the SEC, which has gained a reputation as having the best coaches in college football for much of the 1990s into the 2000s up until a few years ago, and then seeing some of its better coaches leave and maybe possibly having a bit of a revival here in the last couple years with Kirby Smart leading the way. Let's rank them 14 all the way up to number 1. Keep in mind that I'm ranking the coaches right now. So, for example, a couple of years ago, Steve Spurrier was one of the most accomplished coaches in the league, probably next to Nick Saban. He was number 2 in terms of what he accomplished in his career and how good of a coach he was over the span of his career. But I was not ranking legacy. I was not ranking accomplishments or who was the best coach in 1995. I was ranking right now, and Spurrier had dropped down a number of rungs. According to me, I had to give him some credit based on his legacy of what he accomplished, that he would always be stable and always be a capable coach if he coached until he was 80. But I had to knock him down based on a current performance. So with 3 new coaches in the SEC, this is a bit difficult because, of course, they don't have a track record right in the SEC. So a few years ago, Brett Bielema, with what he did at Wisconsin, would be considered one of the top 10 or 15 coaches in college football. But then he comes to Arkansas, and I tended to, obviously, the longer he was at Arkansas, disassociate what he accomplished at Wisconsin and just rate him on what he did at Arkansas. But that first ranking, when he first arrived in Fayetteville, I had to rank him based on Wisconsin because he hadn't done anything with Arkansas. But once he had that one season under his belt, then I just wiped the slate clean and I ranked him based on his performance currently and what I expected. So this isn't just a ranking based on record and championships currently, because obviously some coaches have less to work with. Vanderbilt, much less in terms of resources and recruiting base, money, facilities, the academic challenges there in bringing in football players versus in Alabama, of course, Florida, Auburn, and some of the powers in the SEC. So I take that into consideration, and we break it down like this. Derek Mason's number 14 at Vanderbilt. Derek Mason has been a coach in college football since 1994. It's been a long time, and he really did a great job with the Stanford defense from 2010 until he got the coaching job to lead the program at Vanderbilt. Consider what James Franklin did at Vandy. Back-to-back seasons to finish out his Vandy career before he got the Penn State job. He went 9-4 back-to-back years, won bowl games, and finished in the top 25. So Derek Mason inherited much of that talent, and he kind of fell flat on his face out of the gate. His first game, they lost to Temple, 37-7, and that Temple team was pretty decent, but not great. They didn't score an offensive touchdown, and he just looked like he was a deer in headlights right out of the gate. First SEC Media Days, he looked overmatched, and his team looked overmatched for that particular season. He bounced back the next year to go to a bowl game. They got annihilated by NC State, but he at least won 6 games, got to a bowl game. Last year, back to 1-7 in the SEC. So the record doesn't look kindly and favorable upon Derek Mason at 18-31 at Vandy, 6-26 in the SEC. And yes, it's difficult to win at Vandy, but go close to 500 in the SEC. If he was racking up 4-4s and 3-5s in the SEC, I would rate him much higher. But 6-26 in the SEC after James Franklin did what he did in going 9-4, 9-4. And so, yes, he had the big win against Kansas State this past season. Impressive showing considering Kansas State went on to win a bowl game and finished with 9 wins. But then they turn around, they lose to Alabama 59-0. Well, even if there's no shame in losing to Bama by 59 points, they lost to Ole Miss by 22. They lost to Kentucky by 23 and Missouri by 28. Derek Mason consistently doesn't have his team prepared. He's at number 14. All right, now we have to rank some coaches based on what they've done, what I project them to do in the SEC. Chad Morris at Arkansas comes in at number 13. He's got a 6-year contract in Fayetteville for $21 million. Okay, He went to SMU as the head coach. He went 7-5 in his third year. It took him some time to build the program, but that was a program that was disastrous. 1-11 before he got there. He got it to a 7-5 point his final season, finished at 14-22 at SMU. Before that, consider what he did not as a head coach at Clemson, but offensive coordinator. Clemson was 15-12 the 2 seasons prior to Chad Morris. Then he took over the offense with Taj Boyd and company between 2011 and 14. They went 42-11 from 15-12 to 42-11 in Clemson, and they've taken off ever since. Chad Morris, Arkansas. I expect him to struggle in the SEC based on the lack of resources, the lack of recruiting in Arkansas, and the challenges there. But it's a historic program. Chad Morris should be winning 8 games at Arkansas after a couple seasons. If not, he will have not succeeded. All right. Number 12, I go Jeremy Pruitt. Because of his recruiting prowess, I give him a nod over Chad Morris. Defensive coordinator, of course, extraordinaire at Alabama, Georgia, and Florida State. 2-time Broyles finalist for Assistant of the Year in college football. Again, his recruiting is storied. Its legacy, it's well known throughout the South that Jeremy Pruitt can recruit. And think Tennessee's coming off 0-8. He's taking over a bit of a mess, but not void of talent. Expect them to do pretty well. He has never been a head coach. Nowhere. High school, nowhere on his resume. It's going to be interesting for Jeremy Pruitt. He's a nuts and bolts kind of guy. He's not the salesman Butch Jones was, and that's probably a good thing for Tennessee. I got Pruitt at 12. Number 11, Joe Moorhead, coming from Penn State, offensive coordinator in 2016 and 17. We know how explosive Penn State was in those 2 seasons. Of course, they had the best running back in football, Saquon Barkley, a load of receivers, including Jawan Johnson and Deshaun Hamilton, Mike Gesicki, a tight end, one of the best in the business, and Trace McSorley, a playmaker at quarterback. So what does he do with a little bit less talent, established talent in Mississippi State? Before that, as a head coach, he went 38-13 at Fordham. And consider he took the same Penn State talent, basically, that averaged 348 yards per game the season before he took over as offensive coordinator. And then as OC, he upped that 348 per game yardage to 432. He's considered an extraordinary play caller, a guy that understands offense, understands defense, understands matchups, getting the right guys in space, and creating mismatches on the field and setting up a defense. Marcus Allen, an all Big Ten safety, basically said when we took over, or Joe Moorhead showed up on campus, our defense dominated in practice. We laughed at them, and Joe Moorhead told us, we're going to come after you, and we're going to be the better unit here very soon. So get your yucks in right now. You're the better defense. You're the better unit right now, but our offense is going to make plays on you very soon, and that's what happened. The Penn State players say he's a genius. They vouch for him across the board, and he got off the plane in Starkville and started asking about ring sizes. He's confident he can win at Mississippi State. He's number 11. At number 10, I've got Coach O at LSU. Difficult to really review his tenure at LSU. He took over mid-season. He went 6-2 that first season, then 8-4 with a bowl loss last year. Okay. The Ole Miss situation was a disaster when he was there. He went 10-25, 3-21 in the SEC, but again, not evaluating that. He took over a USC team in 2013 and steadied the ship, went 6-2 down the stretch. So again, 6-2 with LSU 2 years ago and 9-4 this past season after a Citrus Bowl loss. Okay, he's got a couple bad losses on his resume. Of course, the Troy game in Death Valley, and losing to Mississippi State 37-7. Coming off a shutout of BYU to start the season, things were looking up. We didn't know how lousy BYU was, and they lose by 30 at Mississippi State. They need to find an identity on offense. He has failed to do that in what has been almost 2 full seasons. They're expected to win 7 or 8 games because the schedule's so difficult. I expect, unless they're a disaster this year and they go 5-7, that he's going to make it through this season. Let's say 7-5, then they win a bowl game, 8-5, 7-6, something in that range, even 9-4, and he'll be on the hot seat for 2019, most likely. They've got a huge buyout if they want to get rid of him, And so there's no reason at this point that Coach O's on the hot seat, but he's only the 10th best coach in the SEC right now based on what he's accomplished and based on what I see right now, because as a strategist, he's marginal at best. I'm being kind. He's a guy that's going to rally the troops. The kids love him. They'll run through a brick wall. Sounds familiar at LSU. Les Miles. All right, at number 9, we go to Ole Miss and Matt Luke. Not much to go on here, but he took over just a difficult situation with the Ole Miss Rebels. Hugh Freeze, disaster, doing all the stupid stuff off the field, the misconduct, and putting that program in a bad position in regards to integrity and character and a flawed reputation, then also all the recruiting violations. So he's got to take over a program and a team that has nothing to play for at the end of the season. He turns in a respectable campaign at 6-6, 3-5 in the SEC. Yes, they lost to Alabama 66-3, but other than that, unlike Vandy and what I pointed out with Derek Mason, with consistency of getting blown out and being ill-prepared, Matt Luke's team showed up every week, aside from the Bama game, and they looked good. Consider this. Ole Miss felt comfortable enough to keep Matt Luke following what he accomplished. They didn't get rid of him. He's been an assistant at Tennessee, Duke, and Ole Miss, mostly under David Cutcliffe, and performed well, and everybody says great things about Matt Luke. We'll see if he can raise the level of Ole Miss to what you would expect a successful Ole Miss program to be, 8-4 on a consistent basis and going to decent bowl games. Matt Luke at number 9. Number 8, we go to Mizzou and Barry Odom. His stock obviously rising, 11-14, 6-10 in the SEC in 2 years. 1 in the SEC, 1-7 in the SEC with just the one win in 2000 and just the one season back, and then he comes back and has a really nice season last year at 4-4. 8 years coaching under Gary Pinkel had to rub off. Gary Pinkel was a tremendous coach, of course, won 2 division championships in the SEC. He's at a recruiting disadvantage like no other school in the conference there in Missouri against everybody in the division, everybody in the SEC. And to date, we see some good things. Now we'll see what he can do without Drew Lock, if he can replace him and continue the surge that was 7-6 last season for Barry Odom, the 8th best coach in the SEC. All right, Mark Stoops at number 7 at Kentucky. He's in his 6th season already, and it's been a slow climb. So Kentucky, before Mark Stoops took over, was 4-20 in the SEC in the previous 3 seasons. 4-20. Okay, he started off 2-10, and the program was that bad. It wasn't a bad season by him. They were that awful. 2 wins, then 5-7, 5-7. Not getting to a bowl game was a bit frustrating. Then the last 2 years, he gets to a bowl game, and they lose to Georgia Tech, where they're not prepared for the game. They got slaughtered. And then last year, it was a toss-up, and Benny Snell got knocked out of the game by the stupid officials' call, and they lost to finish 7-6. So he's got 2 bowl losses. So like I was telling a Kentucky fan the other night who asked me, go from 7-5 with a bowl loss to finish 7-6. Up that, a win in the regular season, then a win in the bowl game. Beat a like-seeded team outside of the conference, and that's improvement, progress for Mark Stoops. Compete in the SEC Eastern Division, similar to what South Carolina did last year. Not challenging Georgia, but compete in the SEC Eastern Division near the top. That would be good for him. They've gone from joke to bad to decent. Mark Stoops at number 7. All right, we go to South Carolina for the 6th best coach in the SEC, and his stock is rising as well, of course, Will Muschamp. From 3 wins before he got there to 6 wins to 9 wins with the bowl victory versus Michigan as a big underdog. He's a defensive guru. We knew that from his days all over the conference. He failed in his one outing at Florida as head coach. He had the big 2012 where they won 11 games, went to the Sugar Bowl, lost to Teddy Bridgewater in Louisville, went 28-21 at Florida. So he's showing himself to be, this is a bit of an overstatement, but like Bill Belichick, who was not prepared to be a head coach, great, all-time great defensive mind, comes to Cleveland, doesn't succeed as a head coach because he doesn't understand the organizational structure and what he needs to do as a head coach. Maybe Will Muschamp is doing likewise at South Carolina. We'll see if the trajectory continues up and if he's figured it out. Will Muschamp at number 6. All right, I go to, what was Mississippi State? Now Florida. Dan Mullen at number 5. I think his tenure at Mississippi State is a little bit overplayed. People say, okay, he won at Mississippi State. He's a great coach. Well, people have won at Mississippi State in the past. They were down from about 2002 or 3 up until Dan Mullen showing up. For those 5 years, they were really bad. But before that, Jackie Sherrill, I was looking at Sherrill versus Mullen. Jackie Sherrill did at least as well as Dan Mullen. So let's not anoint Dan Mullen as being a guy that can win all sorts of, big games and get to higher tier bowl games with less than adequate resources and recruiting base and all of that. He did a good job at Mississippi State. I think it's a little bit overblown. He was 69-46. He went 33-39 in the SEC, 11-13 the last 3 years, and it's a difficult division. If you go 4-4, 5-3 in the SEC Western Division, that's doing something at a Mississippi State. But he only went over 500. That 1 year when they went to number 1 in the country under Dak Prescott in 2014, that was the only season, one season in the SEC, did Dan Mullen finish over 500 at 5-3. Other than that, they always went 500 or below 500. 33-39 tells us basically they went 500 every year. 3-5, 4-4, all the time. He was only ranked 3 times in the final poll in 9 years at Mississippi State. Again, Jackie Sherrill, he had a winning record in the SEC 4 times. He was 15 games over 500 his first 9 years versus Dan Mullen's 33-39 record in the SEC. So Dan Mullen, good job at Mississippi State. Let's see what he does with more to work with in Gainesville. At number 4, I go Jimbo Fisher. I originally had Mullen over Fisher. Then I considered, because I was ranking right now, obviously Fisher's had the better career. He's won the national championship. His teams were really good at Florida State. But I thought Mullen might be better right now. But looking at Dan Mullen's got to prove something to me. So Jimbo Fisher at number 4, of course, offensive coordinator at LSU and Florida State. They were big winners, especially his time at LSU. He takes over at Florida State. The program was down after Bobby Bowden's last few seasons, and he ranked Florida State in the top 10 4 times in 7 years, ranked in the top 10 in the nation, won the national championship, of course, with Jameis Winston and company, a NFL talent-laden roster in 2013. They got back to the college football playoff in 2014, weren't nearly as good, blown out by Oregon. He did let Clemson take over that division and take over the conference. He had the program. He had the team to dominate the ACC, and he let Dabo Swinney run right by him and take over the ACC. And his last season was not impressive in Tallahassee. I understand the DeAndre Francois situation, but other elite programs do not collapse after they lose their starting quarterback. We've seen it happen, of course, most notably at Ohio State, but other places, they lose their starting quarterback, they can rebound. Georgia did it with Jacob Eason and Jake Fromm. If you're an elite program, you lose your starting quarterback, sure, that might be the difference between contending for a national championship and going 9-3, but you don't collapse to 6-6, and that's what Jimbo Fisher allowed to have happen and Clemson to take over. Okay, big money at Texas A&M. He's got the resources. He's got the recruiting base. He's got everything in place to win big. Let's watch it happen. Jimbo Fisher at number 4. All right, at number 3, I'm going Gus Malzahn at Auburn. It's either been average seasons for him or he's had the spike. Now, if we go back to 2010, he was the offensive coordinator and pretty much ran that offense and ran the team in a certain sense with Gene Chizik on the sideline as they won the national championship. Then, of course, he turned in one of the great reclamation projects in the history of college football. I can't think of a better one when he took over a team that went 3-9, 0-8 in the SEC in 2012, and he came within 7 seconds of a national championship. Let that sink in. 0-8 in the best conference in America. Then you win the conference and go to the national championship. Then they kind of tapered off from there. They went 8-5, 7-6, 8-5. That's only 23-16 at Auburn. Auburn should not be going 23-16 over 3 years. They did, of course, again, have another SEC championship game appearance. They had the brilliant 2 performances over the number 1 teams in Georgia and Alabama in 3 weeks. But, of course, they couldn't complete the run and beat Georgia again and looked pretty marginal in losing 28-7. He's got a top 10 to 15 program, and that's where Auburn should be. So he's pretty much done what you would expect. They should be SEC contenders most of the time. He's won with a triple option with Nick Marshall. He's won with a more, not necessarily pro style to the hilt, but spread formation pro style with Jarrett Stidham. He's an offensive guru. He knows how to run the program. He's got the big contract extension. Gus Malzahn at number 3 in the SEC. All right, at number 2, of course, he has yet to really prove it over a long period of time, but he's done enough in 2 seasons. And with the future looking more than bright, for me to rank Kirby Smart at number 2 and feel very comfortable about that. He took over a really good program, one of the 10 to 15 best in the nation under Mark Richt, and he's raised it big. 8-5 the first year. You got to let that one season settle in. 8-5 after a bowl win over TCU, and then they explode. And they're arguably the best team in the country. You'd have to rate them second best. Of course, they lost the national championship, but did they play better than Alabama? I think so. I think that they were the better team on the field, but they didn't make the plays in the end. So he goes to a national championship game. Let that sink in his second season with a program that was constantly finishing second in the East, not getting to the SEC title game, and he takes them to the national championship game, wins a Rose Bowl. And they did it with defense. They did it with running game. In the Rose Bowl, they did it with a passing game, helping out the running game and the defense to score a lot of points against Oklahoma. Mark Richt won the SEC, I believe, twice in 15 years. Kirby Smart did it in year number 2. He's number 2, and the recruiting is taking off. And then, of course, we get to the number 1 coach in the SEC, the number 1 coach in college football, the number 1 coach of all time, Nick Saban of Alabama. So, should I really say anything here? We know that he's number 1. If I was rating based on legacy, like a lot of people do, and record and championships and all of that, he would be number 1. If I'm rating them based on who do I want coaching my team this season, it's still Nick Saban. And it's Kirby Smart number 2. And it's exactly the way I listed them. Who did I want to coach the team this season? Nick Saban's number 1. His teams play with tenacity and poise. They play under pressure. Whatever he does, he knows how to get that team prepared to rise to the occasion. Trust the process, the Nick Saban process. He's the greatest of all time. He's the best in the conference. He's the best that we've seen in college football. Urban Meyer challenged him for a long time, and Urban Meyer is one of the top 5 in the history of the game, but Nick Saban's number 1. And, of course, the best in the SEC. So that's my list. I got, let's run it through one more time. At number 14, we got Derek Mason of Vanderbilt. At number 13, Chad Morris, Arkansas. Number 12, Jeremy Pruitt of Tennessee. Joe Moorhead at number 11, coming from Penn State to Mississippi State. Coach O had Orgeron at number 10. Matt Luke, Ole Miss at number 9. Number 8 is Barry Odom of Mizzou. Number 7, Mark Stoops, Kentucky. Will Muschamp at number 6 from South Carolina. We got Dan Mullen, Florida, number 5. And number 4, Jimbo at Texas A&M, taking over there. Gus Malzahn at number 3 at Auburn. Kirby Smart, and what a job he has done at Georgia at number 2. And Nick Saban is the greatest of all time as we stand right now. He is, of course, number 1 in the SEC. Would love to hear from you. Comments galore. Go nuts. Rank the coaches in the SEC. Let me hear what you have right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football.